Over the years, I've offered advice and had one-on-one conversations with thousands of churches, big churches, small churches, and everything in between. And through these back and forth discussions, it's become apparent to me that certain beliefs exist about smaller churches that are untrue. And so in this video, you'll learn about 5 small church beliefs that I continually encounter, and you'll also learn why each of these beliefs is actually a myth, because all 5 of them are demonstrably untrue.
Well, hey there, and welcome to Pro Church Tools, the show where in 10 minutes or less, you're going to get a dose of tips and tactics to help your church share the message of Jesus, while we navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm your host, Alex Mills, joined as always by the boss man, Brady Shearer.
Alex, today we want to talk about certain myths and beliefs that many of our churches, many of our pastors, and many of us leaders within the church hold that I have found to be untrue. And so without holding back at all, let's dive into the first one. Myth number 1 is that most people prefer bigger churches.
Of course they do.
This is a belief that I held personally for a very long time. And I think the reason that this belief has become apparent, why we believe it, is because the visibility and the influence of larger churches, especially mega churches, in the church subculture can make it feel like, man, I look up to these churches this much because it seems like they're doing so many great things from the outside. This must be how all of my congregation feels as well.
Yeah, and it's so easy to do like on a community level because I'm thinking about my church compared to your church, Brady. Like my church is about 100 people and your church is a few thousand. And so it would be easy and if not logical for me to look at my congregation and say, okay, there's 100 people who choose to be here on a Sunday. And I look at your congregation and think, okay, well, there's a few thousand people that choose to be at your church on a Sunday. And so clearly more people prefer to be in your church than they do in my church. And that must mean that more people like bigger churches than they do smaller churches. And what we've learned is that's just simply not true.
Yeah, what does the data say in this respect? This is from Barna. 46% of churchgoers attend a church of 100 or fewer. Only 8% of American churchgoers attend a church of 1,000 or more. And you might be saying, yeah, well, Brady, that's just because there are less megachurches. But if you think about Alex's church versus my church, just the number of people on an average weekend, my church is 20 times larger. Yes, there are fewer megachurches, but they're so much bigger that the number of people that attend them should pretty much offset the fewer number of overall churches. And if you look at our region, I'm glad that you brought that up. There is one big megachurch, and that's mine, and let's say it's 2,000 on a weekend. And then there are dozens and dozens of churches of 100, around 100, maybe a bit more. And a lot more people attend those churches overall than attend our church.
Right.
And it's not like our church is too far for you to drive. We live in a non-metro area, just kind of like regular, normal Canada. And people could drive to our church, but based on their attendance, they're kind of voting with their attendance.
Yeah.
They're saying we prefer this kind of smaller gathering.
Yeah, this data set is conclusive. Most people prefer smaller churches.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, maybe that's overall people, but what about young people? And this is myth number 2. Young people, well, they definitely prefer bigger churches, right? I mean, maybe overall, those older people with their kids and, they've been at the church forever. Maybe they prefer the smaller church, but these young kids, we're seeing this decline in attendance, especially among young people. Only 2 out of 10 millennials think church attendance is important, but those 2 definitely prefer the big church, right?
Definitely.
Well, apparently not, because another Barna study, and this comes from their book Making Space for Millennials, found that just 8% of millennials say they don't attend church because it's outdated. And the reason that I use that is because if you are a mega church, it's highly unlikely that your Sunday morning experience, your weekend experience, would be considered outdated. Right? That's likely, your church is likely very attractional. It's based around a big, huge experiential event. And you might be thinking, if you're a smaller church, that's what young people want, but we have found that is not the case whatsoever. In fact, what younger people generally want is community. They want relationship. They want to feel like they know the person sitting next to them, like they are, actually involved in their life. And that is actually very difficult to foster when you have so many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in your auditorium week in and week out. In fact, in a church of 100-ish, a smaller church, it's a lot easier to develop real community because it doesn't feel like there's this huge hurdle or obstacle, like we're just coming in for an event and leaving. And so forget this being a disadvantage to smaller churches. I think it's an actual advantage.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And as a pastor of a smaller church, this next myth we're about to talk about kind of hits me in a sweet spot. It's a little bit personal to me because I have believed this myth for a long time, and it's important. It's important to learn, and I hope that's what this episode is helping us all do today. Is this one is so important to learn that this is just simply not true.
Myth number 3, perhaps the most pervasive and most troubling, most problematic. Smaller churches lack, and then insert whatever you want.
Yeah.
They lack the right leader. They lack a certain skill set. They lack a certain resource. They lack, heck, I've heard it said, the anointing of a larger church. If you're a church of significant influence and numbers, you must be doing something right.
Mm-hmm.
Inversely, if you are a church of a much smaller influence and numbers of people, that must mean you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, and then you start to think and even start to believe, well, if only we had this, if only we had A or B or C, whether it's more resources or a better teaching pastor or, just insert whatever you want. If only we had whatever we believe we're lacking that's holding us back, well, then we'd see exponential growth. Then we'd be the next big mega church on the block. And that's just simply not true.
With the passing of Eugene Peterson recently, we've been seeing a lot of his material and his work being spread around. And one quote that I've come across recently that I have not been able to shake in the last couple of weeks, Eugene Peterson was in his late 80s when he made this quote. He was on a podcast being interviewed. So at this point, late in his life, reflecting on his pastoral career and everything that he's done in the world of church through that career. And he says this, go to the closest church where you live and the smallest. After 6 months, if it isn't working, go to the next smallest church. The interviewer says, what is it about small rather than big? And Peterson responds, because you have to deal with people as they are. You've got to learn how to love them when they are not lovable. Mm-hmm. And that quote implies that while that is very easy to do in a smaller church, it's much more difficult in a larger church.
Yeah.
And if that is the case, and I believe it to be, that means that larger churches are actually at a significant disadvantage. It's easy for a larger church to be lacking something that is core to what church is meant to be.
Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about community on the podcast, in our personal conversations when we were discussing Church Home, the new app the Church Home Global, the new app from Church Home Church, just discussing like, what is church? And maybe a better question, who is church? And I'm loving these conversations we're having because we're kind of learning again and reminding ourselves that church is comprised of people, and without people, there is no church. And Eugene Peterson nails it here. He's like, you have to find a community of people to belong to, and a church is nothing if it's not made up of people, and people are hard to love. And for anyone who's ever
definitely hard to love. Just ask Alex.
Well, for anyone who's ever worked in ministry and whether a pastoral position or a leadership position in church, that's the hardest part of church is just staying in love with people because it's messy. We're all messy and we're all a little bit messed up. And so you can't separate church from people. And so like you said, smaller churches may have an advantage here because there's less unlovable people to love in those groups. And so you can learn to love better in a smaller community like that.
Small church myth number 4, smaller churches are at a disadvantage because they are under-resourced. This probably actually used to be true, but with the advent of the biggest communication shift in 500 years, digital media, it is now easier and more affordable than ever to reach people. For instance, for years, the biggest thing that a big church would do would be to send out mailer ads, direct mail. So they would just, flyer every single home in the community, in the city, thousands and thousands of direct mail send outs, flyers, and that cost a lot of money. And now we have social media. And to make this as an example, Life Marketing put together a study that said, okay, if we wanted to reach 1,000 people, what would be the most affordable and the least affordable way of doing it? Direct mail costs more than 20 times more money to reach 1,000 people than social media does. And so maybe in the past, it would be harder for a small church to reach people, but thanks to the internet, it's kind of the great equalizer. It levels the playing field. And then finally, small church myth number 5, smaller churches will never have the impact that larger churches do. The problem here is that when we define impact, we often, like we define church health overall and growth overall, is by number of people in seats.
Right.
What you can't actually measure here is width versus depth. Sure, maybe a larger church is going to reach 1,000 or 2,000 people every weekend, and a smaller church is only going to reach 100. But how deep, how much life change is actually happening there? And this is something that is ambiguous, and there's no surefire answer. And maybe a larger church is having more of an influence, but it definitely is a weak and not a holistic measuring point to just look at number of people, number of views, amount of giving, and say that church is definitely having more of an impact.
Yeah, we're learning that there's a better way to measure church growth and church health. And sure, we can count the number of butts and seats, and that can be an element to how we're determining how, what's going on at our church. But there's a more holistic way to measure church growth, and we're learning all about it. And like you said, you kind of hit on that subject of width versus depth. And that's so vital when analyzing what we're doing as a church and how we're doing as a church. There's a new and better way to analyze church growth, and we're learning all about it.
At the end of the day, big churches, small churches both have their strengths and weaknesses. The reason we wanted to publish this episode is because too often we look at big churches and say that is success, and smaller churches say something is going wrong there, where in reality, that could not be any further from the truth.
Yeah.
That'll do it for this episode of Pro Church Tools. We'll see you next time. Hey, you made it the whole length of the video. What's next? Subscribe.
I like that. Do you like this? Tell us. Hit the like button.
Subscribe.